Midnight swap. The countdown had already begun when Eliza Morrow realized she didn't know what to wish for. Around her, the rooftop terrace pulsed with the energy of 200 people who had paid obscene amounts of money to watch the city explode into light from 37 stories above the street, their faces illuminated by the glow of phones held aloft to capture a moment they would never actually experience because they were too busy documenting it, their voices rising in a crescendo of anticipation that felt to Eliza less like celebration and more like a collective ritual whose meaning had been forgotten long ago, but whose motions continued out of habit and fear of what might happen if they stopped. 10. The crowd shouted the number like a prayer, like an invocation, like the first syllable of a spell that would transform the arbitrary passage of 1 second into another, into something significant, something that mattered, something that could draw a line between who they had been and who they might become. 9. Eliza's champagne glass was warm in her hand. She had been holding it for too long without drinking, the bubbles gone flat, the liquid approaching room temperature in a way that felt like a metaphor for something she didn't want to examine too closely. 8. Her husband was somewhere in the crowd, probably near the bar, probably talking to the colleague whose name Eliza couldn't remember, but whose laugh she recognized from across any room. That particular bark of performative amusement that Marcus used when he was networking rather than genuinely entertained. 7. She should find him. She should be standing beside him when the clock struck midnight. Should be the person he kissed when the year turned over. Should be fulfilling the role of wife in the public performance that their marriage had become. 6. But her feet wouldn't move, and her eyes had fixed on something in the distance. Not the skyline, not the crowd, not the massive digital clock projected onto the building across the street that was counting down the final seconds of a year she wanted desperately to forget. 5. She was looking at the darkness between the buildings, the negative space where the city's light couldn't reach, the shadows that seemed to grow deeper as the countdown accelerated, as if the turning of the year was creating a vacuum that the darkness was rushing to fill. 4. Her mother had died in February. Her father had followed in August, not from grief, the doctors insisted, but from the same cancer that had taken her mother, a genetic destiny that had been waiting in both of them like a timer set decades ago, counting down to an ending that no amount of treatment or hope or desperate bargaining could delay. 3. Eliza had spent the year burying them both, settling their estates, sorting through the accumulated artifacts of two lives that had created hers and then ended without warning, without mercy, without giving her time to say the things she had always assumed she would eventually say, because there was always more time, there was always tomorrow, there was always next year. 2. The grief sat in her chest like a stone, like a tumor of its own, like something that had taken up permanent residence in the architecture of her body and was slowly reshaping everything around it to accommodate its presence. 1. And in the moment before the crowd screamed and the fireworks erupted and the new year crashed into existence with all the subtlety of a demolition, Eliza Morrow closed her eyes and made a wish that she had never articulated before, had never allowed herself to think in complete sentences, had kept locked in a box in the basement of her consciousness where the shameful things lived. Take away the pain that made me who I am. The words formed in her mind with a clarity that surprised her, as if she were reading them from a document rather than composing them, as if the wish had existed before she made it and she was simply giving it voice for the first time. Take away the pain that made me who I am. She felt something shift, not physically, nothing in the external world changed. The crowd still screamed, the fireworks still exploded, the champagne in her hand was still flat and warm, but somewhere inside her, in a location she couldn't name or point to on an anatomical diagram, something moved, something adjusted, something was processed. The moment passed, the year began, and Eliza Morrow opened her eyes to a world that looked exactly the same but felt, in some way she couldn't immediately identify, profoundly and irreversibly different. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 days later, when Eliza realized she couldn't remember her mother's voice. Not couldn't recall it in the way that memories fade over time, becoming softer and less distinct until they are more impression than recording. This was different. This was absence. When she tried to summon the memory of her mother speaking, any memory, any words, any of the thousands of conversations they had shared over 34 years of Eliza's life, she found nothing. Not silence, emptiness. A space where the memory should be but wasn't, like opening a filing cabinet and finding the drawer missing entirely, not just empty but non-existent, as if the architecture of her mind had been subtly restructured to eliminate the places where certain information had been stored. She tested other memories. Her mother's face, still there, though oddly flat, like a photograph rather than a living image. Her mother's smell, present but distant, a fact she knew rather than a sensation she could recreate. The feeling of her mother's hand on her forehead when she was sick as a child, completely absent, not even a shadow of the warmth she knew she should be able to recall. Eliza sat at her kitchen table and cataloged the losses with the methodical precision she had applied to settling her parents' estates, making lists of assets and liabilities, trying to determine the scope of what had been removed. The pain of losing her mother, gone. The pain of losing her father, gone. The guilt of not being there when her mother took her final breath, gone. The shame of feeling relieved when her father's suffering finally ended, gone. The grief that had sat in her chest like a stone for 10 months, all of it, simply gone, as if someone had performed surgery on her emotional architecture and excised the parts that hurt without bothering to cauterize the wounds or document what had been removed. She waited for the horror to arrive, waited for the panic, the fear, the desperate need to recover what had been taken. The horror didn't come. Neither did the panic. Neither did anything that felt like appropriate concern for having lost something that should have been fundamental to her identity. She noted this absence of reaction with the same clinical detachment she had applied to cataloging the other absences, and she wondered if the capacity for appropriate reaction had also been removed, had been classified as pain and processed accordingly, had been part of the package that her wish had specified for deletion. Take away the pain that made me who I am. She had meant it as hyperbole, as the kind of exaggerated emotional shorthand that people used when they were suffering and wanted relief without really thinking about what relief would mean. She had not meant it literally, but something had taken it literally. Something had processed her wish with the precision of an administrative system that did not interpret emotional nuance or consider collateral damage, that simply executed the parameters as specified and filed the results without judgment or follow-up. Eliza sat at her kitchen table in the gray morning light of January and understood, with a clarity that should have been terrifying but wasn't, that she was no longer the person who had made the wish. That person had wished for relief from pain. That person had been granted the wish. And in the granting, that person had been erased, replaced by someone who looked identical and possessed most of the same memories and could function perfectly well in all the contexts that had defined her life, but who was, in some fundamental and irreversible way, someone else entirely. Marcus noticed before she did. Not explicitly, he didn't sit her down and ask what had changed, didn't express concern about her mental state, didn't suggest therapy or medication or any of the interventions that might have been appropriate if he had recognized the scope of what had happened. But he behaved differently. He touched her less. He maintained more physical distance when they were in the same room. He looked at her for longer periods without speaking, his expression not suspicious exactly, but curious, evaluative, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces had been subtly rearranged without his knowledge. "You seem better," he said one evening, a week after New Year's, when they were eating dinner at the kitchen island where they always ate dinner when they were too tired to set the table properly. Eliza looked up from her pasta. "Better how?" "I don't know." He frowned, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "More, settled, less." He trailed off, searching for a word he couldn't find. "Less sad?" she offered. "No, less something else." He shook his head. "I don't know how to describe it. You're different. Different bad or different good? I don't know yet." He went back to eating, and Eliza watched him with the detached interest of a researcher observing a subject, noting his body language, his micro-expressions, the way he seemed to be unconsciously orienting himself away from her, even while looking directly at her. He was afraid. Not consciously, not overtly, but somewhere in the primitive brain where threat detection happened faster than thought, Marcus had identified that something about his wife had changed in a way that triggered the ancient warning systems designed to recognize when a familiar member of the tribe had been replaced by something else. Eliza registered this recognition without feeling anything about it. She noted that she should feel something, hurt, perhaps, or concern about her marriage, or fear of being discovered. But the noting was intellectual rather than emotional. Observation about the absence of expected responses rather than the responses themselves. The pain that had defined her relationship with Marcus, the frustration of feeling unseen, the loneliness of sharing a bed with someone who lived in a different emotional country, the grief of watching her parents die while her husband offered comfort that never quite reached the places where she needed it. All of that was gone, and with it had gone the investment. She no longer cared whether Marcus understood her, because the part of her that had needed understanding had been classified as pain and removed. She no longer felt the loneliness, because loneliness required wanting connection, and the want had been excised along with everything else that hurt. She was present in her marriage the way one might be present in a waiting room, aware of her surroundings, capable of interaction, but fundamentally uninvested in outcomes because she was just passing through. This should have bothered her. It didn't. And the fact that it didn't should have bothered her even more. It didn't. She was beginning to understand that the wish had not just removed pain, but had removed the capacity to be troubled by the absence of pain, had cauterized the wound so completely that she couldn't even feel the scar tissue where her emotions used to be. The dreams started in the second week of January. Not nightmares. Nothing about them was frightening in the conventional sense. They were simply vivid in a way that her dreams had not been for years, saturated with color and detail, and a sense of reality that made waking feel like a transition between two equally valid states of existence, rather than an escape from illusion into truth. In the dreams, she was walking through a city that looked like hers but wasn't quite right, the streets at wrong angles, the buildings slightly too tall, the sky a shade of gray that didn't correspond to any weather pattern she could name. She was looking for something, or someone. The dream logic wouldn't let her specify which, kept the object of her search tantalizingly undefined, always just around the next corner, always just through the next door, always close enough that she could feel its proximity, but never close enough that she could see what it was. The dreams progressed as the month went on. By the third week of January, she was having them every night. By the fourth week, she was spending more time in the dream city than in the waking world. Her sleep extending from 7 hours to 9 to 12, her body refusing to wake until it had completed whatever search the dreams were conducting. On January 27th, she found what she was looking for. She had been walking through a part of the dream city that corresponded roughly to the neighborhood where she had grown up, though the houses were different and the trees were the wrong species, and the light came from a direction that didn't match any position of the sun. She turned a corner and saw herself. Not a reflection, not an image on a screen. Herself. Standing in the middle of the street, facing her, wearing the same clothes she had worn on New Year's Eve. The black dress that had cost too much, the heels that had hurt her feet, the necklace her mother had given her for her 30th birthday. This other Eliza looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. No, that wasn't accurate. She could read the expression. She just couldn't understand how an expression could contain that much complexity, that many layers of emotion, that degree of intensity. The other Eliza was feeling everything: grief, rage, terror, confusion, desperation, hope, despair, all of it simultaneously, all of it at full volume, all of it directed at the Eliza who was watching her with the mild interest of someone observing a stranger on a subway platform. "You gave me away," the other Eliza said. Her voice was the same, The same pitch, the same cadence, the same slight rasp that came from years of teaching in classrooms with inadequate ventilation. But there was something underneath the voice that the original Eliza no longer had. There was depth. There was resonance. There was the unmistakable timbre of a person whose identity had been forged in the furnace of suffering and emerged stronger for the heat. "I didn't give you away," Eliza heard herself say. "I wished for relief." "You wished me away," the other said. "The part of you that felt things, the part that was real. You wished it away, and now I'm here, and you're there, and neither of us is whole." Eliza considered this. "I feel fine," she said. The other Eliza laughed. A terrible sound, full of grief and recognition, and a particular kind of pity that only someone who had once been whole could feel for someone who no longer knew what they were missing. "Of course you feel fine," she said. "Feeling fine is all you can do now. That's all they left you." "They?" "The system, the mechanism, whatever it is that processes the wishes and redistributes the weight." The other Eliza took a step closer. "Did you think it was magic? Did you think it was God? It's neither. It's administrative. It's a filing system. It takes what you don't want and gives it to someone who needs it, or who deserves it, or who was simply next in the queue. And you received what I gave away. I received everything you gave away. Your grief, your guilt, your love, your fear, all the parts of you that hurt, which were also the parts of you that meant anything." The other Eliza's face contorted with emotion that the original could no longer produce. "Do you know what it's like? To suddenly inherit a lifetime of pain without any of the context? To feel grief for parents who weren't mine, guilt for failures I didn't commit, love for a husband I've never met?" Eliza considered this question with the same detachment she had been applying to everything since New Year's. "No," she said, "I don't know what that's like. I don't feel anything about anything now." "I know," the other said. "That's the horror. You don't even know what you've lost. You can't miss what you gave away because the capacity to miss it was part of the package." The dream began to dissolve around the edges, the way dreams do when the conscious mind starts to reassert itself, the impossible architecture of the dream city fading into the more familiar shapes of the bedroom where Eliza's body was waking up. "Wait," she heard herself say, though she wasn't sure what she was waiting for, what she wanted from this other version of herself, what questions she should be asking while she still had the chance. "We'll meet again." The other Eliza said, her voice growing fainter as the dream collapsed. "We have to. The system is still processing. The transfer wasn't complete. There's still a connection, still a thread." The dream ended. Eliza woke in her bedroom, in her bed, beside her husband, who was already awake and staring at her with an expression she now recognized. He was afraid of her, not of what she might do, of what she had become. "You were talking in your sleep," he said. "You said, 'I don't feel anything about anything now.'" Eliza sat up. "Did I? You said it over and over, like you were trying to explain something to someone who wasn't there." "Interesting." Marcus's expression shifted from fear to something worse. Disappointment, perhaps, or the particular sadness of someone who is realizing that a person they loved has become someone they no longer recognize. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. It was not a metaphorical question. He was genuinely asking. He was genuinely unsure. Eliza considered the question for longer than she should have, running through possible answers, evaluating each one for accuracy rather than for what it might mean to her marriage or her husband's peace of mind. "I don't know," she finally said. "I think I used to be someone else, but I can't remember what that felt like." Marcus got out of bed without saying anything else. He moved to the guest room that night. He didn't come back. February arrived with the peculiar cruelty of a month that contains the anniversary of a loss that Eliza could no longer properly feel. Her mother had died on February 14th, Valentine's Day, a cosmic joke that had felt unbearably pointed when it happened, the universe arranging its calendar to maximize the irony of losing the woman who had loved her first and longest on the holiday dedicated to love. The first anniversary of the death approached like a deadline in someone else's calendar, something Eliza was aware of intellectually but couldn't connect to emotionally, a date that should have carried weight but felt instead like any other number on any other page. She went through the motions anyway. She ordered flowers. She planned to visit the cemetery. She prepared the words she would say at the grave, the ritual language of grief that she had learned from movies and books and the funeral industry's marketing materials. But when the day arrived, she found that she couldn't go. Not because the emotion was too overwhelming. Nothing was overwhelming anymore. Not because she was avoiding pain. There was no pain to avoid. She couldn't go because she no longer understood why she should. The woman in the cemetery was a stranger now. The relationship Eliza remembered having with her mother felt like something she had read about rather than something she had experienced. The love she knew she should feel was a concept rather than a presence, a word in a language she had once spoken fluently but had since forgotten. She stayed home instead. She sat on the couch in the living room of the apartment she had shared with Marcus before he moved to the guest room, and she tried to summon something, anything, that would connect her to the person she had been, the life she had lived, the pain that had shaped her, and the loss that had defined her final year. Nothing came. The emptiness wasn't painful because pain had been removed. The emptiness wasn't frightening because fear had been removed along with it. The emptiness was simply empty, a void without qualities, a negative space where Eliza Morrow had once existed and where now there was only someone who looked like her and had most of her memories, but who had no idea what any of it meant. She was still sitting on the couch when the doorbell rang. She didn't move immediately. Doorbells had lost their urgency along with everything else, the social pressure to respond to summons having been categorized as a form of anxiety and processed accordingly. The doorbell rang again, then again. Then someone began knocking, hard and insistent, with a particular rhythm that felt familiar in a way Eliza couldn't explain. She got up. She walked to the door. She opened it. The woman standing in the hallway was her. Not a dream this time. Not a vision or a hallucination or a manifestation of guilt that she could no longer feel. The woman was physically present, standing in the corridor of Eliza's apartment building, wearing clothes that Eliza didn't recognize, but that fit her body in ways that suggested ownership rather than borrowing. "You didn't visit the cemetery," the other Eliza said. Her voice was the same, her face was the same, but everything else was different. The way she held herself, the intensity of her gaze, the almost unbearable density of emotion that radiated from her like heat from a furnace. "I couldn't," Eliza said. "I don't remember why I should." "I know." The other woman's eyes were wet. "I remember for both of us now. I carry all of it. The love, the loss, the guilt about not being there when she died, the shame of feeling relieved when it was over, all the parts of you that made you who you were." "Then who am I now?" "I don't know. That's what I came to find out." The other Eliza looked past her into the apartment. "Can I come in? It's your apartment too, or it was." "No, it was never mine. I was born on New Year's Eve when you made your wish. I inherited your pain, but not your possessions, your memories, but not your life. I'm homeless in a world where you still have a home. I'm grieving parents who weren't mine for a woman who gave them away." Eliza stepped aside. The other version of herself entered the apartment and stood in the living room, looking around with an expression of recognition and loss that Eliza could identify but not understand. "It looks the same," the other said. "Everything in its place. The coffee table Mom gave us for our first apartment. The lamp Dad fixed when the socket broke. The photographs we took on our wedding day." She picked up a framed photo from the mantel, Eliza and Marcus, 10 years younger, standing in front of a church with smiles that looked genuine because they were. "Do you remember what this felt like?" The other Eliza held up the photo. "The happiness, the hope, the terror that we might not be enough for each other, but the willingness to try anyway?" "I remember the facts," Eliza said. "I don't remember the feelings." "I know, I have those now." The other woman set the photo down. "I have everything. It's overwhelming. It's unbearable. I feel more than any person should be able to feel, and I have to carry it alone because no one knows I exist, no one believes me when I try to explain, no one understands that I'm not crazy. I'm just the repository for everything you didn't want. I didn't know this would happen. Would it have changed your wish?" Eliza considered the question honestly, thoroughly. without the emotional interference that would have colored her response when she was still capable of emotional interference. "I don't know," she said. "I was in so much pain. The grief was crushing me. I couldn't imagine living another year feeling the way I felt. And now you can't imagine feeling anything at all." "No, now I can't imagine feeling anything at all." The other Eliza sat down on the couch, the same spot where Eliza had been sitting before the doorbell rang, as if she knew where she belonged, even in a home that wasn't hers. "The system is still processing," she said. "The transfer isn't complete. There's still a connection between us, still a thread that the mechanism hasn't severed. That's why I could find you. That's why we can see each other. That's why we're both still here instead of what? Instead of one of us being archived. That's what happens eventually. When the transfer is complete, one version becomes the record, the original file, the identity that persists. The other becomes." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Eliza understood, with a clarity that came from the administrative nature of her new consciousness, what the other woman was describing. The wish system was not just processing her request, it was resolving the paradox her wish had created. There couldn't be two Elizas indefinitely. The mechanism that governed such things would eventually determine which version was primary and which was derivative, which would continue and which would be filed away in whatever archive existed for the surplus products of fulfilled wishes. "How long do we have?" Eliza asked. "I don't know. The processing takes different amounts of time for different cases. Some transfers complete in days. Some take months. Some are never quite finished, leaving both versions to exist in parallel, haunting each other forever. And which one of us persists? Which one becomes the record?" The other Eliza looked at her with an expression that contained more sorrow than the original had felt in her entire life, more than she could feel now, more than she remembered ever being capable of feeling. "I think it depends on which one of us is more real," she said. "Which one of us has more weight? Which one of us is actually living rather than just persisting?" The implication hung in the air between them. The other Eliza was alive with feeling, overflowing with emotion, burning with the intensity of inherited pain and borrowed love, and the desperate urgency of someone who knew her existence was contingent on proving she deserved to exist. The original Eliza was empty, functional, capable of going through the motions of life without ever engaging with its substance. She was the outline of a person, the shell left behind when the interior had been removed, the form without the content. If the system was looking for which version was more real, the original Eliza understood that she might not survive the comparison, and she noted this understanding without feeling anything about it, which was perhaps the most damning evidence of all. The weeks that followed were a strange dance of coexistence. The other Eliza, who began calling herself Liza to differentiate, to create some space between their identities, did not leave. She could not leave. The thread that connected them kept her tethered to the apartment, to the life that had been Eliza's before the wish, to the places and people and things that her inherited memories told her should be home. They developed routines. Eliza went to work in the mornings, teaching her classes at the university with the same competence she had always shown, her students noticing nothing different except perhaps a certain coolness in her demeanor that hadn't been there before, a distance that made them less likely to approach her after class with personal problems or emotional needs. Liza stayed in the apartment during the day, inhabiting the spaces that Eliza had vacated, looking at the photographs, touching the objects, trying to reconcile the memories she now possessed with the reality that she was not the person who had created them. In the evenings, they would talk, not warmly. Warmth required emotion, and Eliza had none to offer, but functionally. They would exchange information, share observations, try to understand what had happened to them and what might happen next. "Marcus moved out," Eliza said one evening in late February, as if reporting the weather. Liza looked up from the photo album she had been studying. "I know. I've been watching him through the window sometimes. He looks lost. He doesn't understand what happened. How could he? He fell in love with someone who doesn't exist anymore. He married a woman who was part you and part me, and now he has neither. Liza's voice cracked with emotion that Eliza could observe but not share. I remember loving him. I remember our wedding night, our first apartment, the miscarriage we never talked about, the way he used to hold me when I woke up from nightmares about my parents dying. I remember all of it, and he doesn't even know I exist. You could tell him. Tell him what? That his wife's pain became a separate person? That I'm the emotional half of the woman he married, walking around in a body that looks exactly like hers but isn't? He'd have me committed. He might. You don't care either way, do you? It was an accusation, but it was also an observation. Liza had learned, over the weeks of their cohabitation, that caring was among the capacities Eliza had lost. I can't care, Eliza said. That was part of the package. Caring requires investment, and investment requires the capacity for pain. I wish that away. You received it. And now I care too much. About everything. About him. About the life we were building. About the future we were supposed to have. Liza closed the photo album. Do you understand how cruel this is? I remember being happy with him. I remember planning children. I remember the vacation we were going to take this summer, the house we were going to buy next year, the life we were going to build together. And none of it is mine. None of it was ever mine. I inherited the memories and the feelings, but not the right to any of it. Eliza considered this. What would you do if the thread was cut, if the processing completed and you were the one who persisted? I'd try to get it back. The life, the husband, the future. Liza's eyes were fierce with wanting. I'd find a way to explain, or to not explain. I'd become you completely if I had to. I'd take over the life you abandoned. I didn't abandon it. You wished away everything that made it matter. That's abandonment. That's worse than abandonment. You didn't leave. You just stopped being present. You're here, but you're not here. You go through the motions, but you don't mean any of it. You're haunting your own life, and I'm the one who has to watch. Eliza didn't argue. She couldn't. Everything Liza said was true, and the capacity to be wounded by truth was among the things she had lost. March arrived with the first hints of spring, and with it came the first signs that the processing was nearing completion. Eliza noticed it first in the way people responded to her. Her colleagues at work, who had been treating her with the careful politeness reserved for people who are going through something difficult, began to look through her. Not at her, through her. As if she were becoming translucent, as if her presence in the world was diminishing, as if the weight of her existence was decreasing moment by moment. Students who had always greeted her in the hallways walked past without acknowledgement. The barista at the coffee shop near campus started forgetting her order, then forgetting her name, then looking at her with the blank confusion of someone trying to place a face they know they should recognize but can't. Marcus, on the rare occasions when he came by the apartment to pick up belongings he had left behind, seemed to struggle to see her even when she was standing directly in front of him. "You're fading," Liza said one evening, with a mixture of hope and horror that Eliza could observe but not feel. "The system is deciding. It's choosing which version of us is real. It seems to be choosing you. I don't want it like this." Liza's voice broke. "I don't want to exist at the cost of erasing you. You're still a person. You still have a right to—" "Do I?" Eliza interrupted. "What makes someone a person? If it's the capacity to feel, to care, to be invested in outcomes, I don't have any of that anymore. I'm a set of functions without a user. I'm a program running without a purpose. Maybe the system is right. Maybe you are the real one." "Don't say that." "Why not? Because it's painful? Because it hurts you to hear me accept my own erasure?" Eliza smiled, and even she could feel how empty the expression was. "That's exactly my point. You can be hurt by this. You have something at stake. I don't. The person who could have cared about her own existence doesn't exist anymore. You're carrying her." Liza was crying now, tears streaming down a face identical to Eliza's, but alive in a way that Eliza's would never be again. "I don't want to be built on your grave," she said. "I don't want to become you by erasing you. You already are me. The parts that matter, the parts that made me worth knowing, worth loving, worth keeping." Eliza reached out and touched Liza's face, wiping away tears she couldn't feel the significance of. You're the version of me that my parents would have recognized, the version Marcus fell in love with, the version that my students connected with and my friends confided in. I'm just the container now, the shell, the filing system where the records used to be kept. There has to be something we can do, some way to reverse it. You want to give back the pain? You want to return what I wished away? Liza's expression shifted, and Eliza saw her actually consider it, actually weigh the possibility of surrendering the emotional depth she had inherited, returning to the void of non-existence that had preceded her birth on New Year's Eve. No, Liza finally said. I don't want to stop existing. I wish there was a way for both of us to be real. The system doesn't allow paradoxes. It processes and resolves. It files and archives. One of us will be the record. One of us will be the duplicate marked for deletion. Eliza stepped back. I think we both know which is which. The final dream came on the last night of Eliza's existence. She didn't know it was the last night. The processing didn't send notifications or provide countdowns. It simply continued until it was complete, and then it filed the results without ceremony or acknowledgement. But she knew, in the way that one knows when a story is approaching its end, that something was about to resolve. In the dream, she was walking through the city again, the same impossible city from her earlier dreams, with its wrong angles and its misplaced light and its architecture that seemed to exist in several states simultaneously. But this time, she wasn't searching for anything. This time, she was being followed. She could feel the presence behind her, patient and administrative, keeping pace without rushing, waiting for her to stop walking so it could complete whatever process her movement was delaying. She understood that this was the system. Not a being, it had no personality, no intention beyond the functional, but a process, a mechanism for resolving contradictions, for determining which versions of reality would persist and which would be archived. She had been running from it since New Year's Eve, in the way that one runs from an ending by refusing to acknowledge its approach. But she was tired now. The empty place where her emotions used to be had no resources for resistance. The shell of herself that remained had nothing left to fuel a flight. She stopped walking. The presence drew closer. She felt it assessing her, measuring the weight of her existence against whatever criteria it used to determine persistence. You are the duplicate, it said, not in words exactly, but in a form of communication that bypassed language entirely, that deposited meaning directly into her consciousness like a file being uploaded to a server. I know, she said. The transfer is complete. The emotional content has been successfully redistributed. The original file has been archived. The active record is now maintained by the receiving entity. The receiving entity. You mean Liza. We mean the version of you that contains sufficient weight to justify persistence. You wished away your pain. Your pain was your weight. Without weight, you cannot maintain position in the filing system. Without position, you cannot persist. So I'm being deleted, archived. The distinction is significant. Deletion implies destruction. Archiving implies preservation in a form that is no longer active, but remains accessible for reference. Eliza considered this. Even now, at the moment of her ending, she couldn't summon the fear that would have been appropriate. The capacity for fear was among the things she had wished away. What will it feel like? She asked. You will experience nothing. You are already incapable of experience in the meaningful sense. The final stage of archiving will simply complete a process that began when your wish was granted. And Liza? The receiving entity will continue. She will assume the active record designation. She will become the version of you that the world remembers. In time, even she will forget that she was not always the original. Will she be happy? The question surprised Eliza even as she asked it. Happiness had ceased to be a category she could apply to herself, but she found that she could still think about it in relation to others, a residual function of empathy that had survived the removal of its emotional substrate. Happiness is not within our jurisdiction, the presence said. We process wishes, we redistribute weight, we resolve paradoxes. What the entities do with their persistence is not our concern. Then what is your concern? Balance. The system must balance. Weight that is wished away must be received somewhere. Emotional debts must be paid. The ledger must reconcile. And if someone wishes for something that can't be balanced, all wishes can be balanced. The question is only how long the processing takes and how many entities are affected by the redistribution. Eliza understood. The wish she had made on New Year's Eve, take away the pain that made me who I am, had been balanced by the creation of Liza, a new entity that could carry what she had rejected. But there might be other wishes in the queue, other requests for redistribution. Other weights being shifted from one consciousness to another in an endless process of rebalancing that treated human identity as a ledger to be reconciled rather than a sacred property to be preserved. "Is there a record," she asked, "of who I was before the wish? You are the record. You will be archived. Your memories, your functions, your residual patterns, all of it will be preserved in a form that can be referenced but not accessed by active entities. So I'll still exist, in the way that a closed file exists, present but not participating, preserved but not conscious, a reference rather than a reality." The presence drew closer, and Eliza felt something beginning, not pain, because pain was gone, but a process, a gradual decrease in the intensity of her existence, like the dimming of a light that had already been turned very low. "One last question," she said. "Proceed. Was the malfunction real? The backlog, the misalignment, the accidental swapping, was any of that true?" The presence paused. In that pause, Eliza understood that she had asked something the system was not designed to answer, that she had touched on something that exceeded the administrative parameters within which it operated. "There was no malfunction," it finally said. "There is never a malfunction. The system processes wishes as they are made, according to their emotional weight and their logical implications. Your wish was processed correctly. The outcome was exactly as specified. So I wasn't swapped with anyone. I just gave myself away. You wished away the pain that made you who you are. The pain was removed. The identity that depended on the pain was removed along with it. The remaining material, the memories, the functions, the physical substrate, required a new identity to organize it. The receiving entity was created to fulfill that requirement. Liza isn't someone who received my pain. She's the person my pain created when it was separated from me. That is an acceptable interpretation." The dimming continued. Eliza felt her existence growing quieter, her consciousness narrowing to a smaller and smaller point of awareness. "I understand now," she said. "The wish wasn't about removing something. It was about becoming someone who had never suffered. But you can't become that person without also becoming no one. You can't erase the pain without erasing the self it shaped." "That is correct. The system attempted to communicate this during the processing window, but you were not receptive. Very few are receptive. The wish arrives from a place of suffering so intense that clarification seems cruel. We process the wish as specified. We do not refuse requests because they are unwise. Even if the request is for annihilation, even then, the system is administrative. It does not judge. It processes." The last of Eliza's awareness contracted to a single point, a final moment of consciousness before the archiving completed. In that moment, she understood everything. She understood that Liza would wake in the morning and find the apartment empty, the other version of herself gone, the processing complete. She understood that Liza would grieve, genuinely, deeply, with all the emotional weight that Eliza had given her, and that the grief would eventually fade into acceptance, and the acceptance would eventually fade into forgetting. She understood that Marcus would return, that Liza would find a way to explain or to not explain, that the life Eliza had wished herself out of would continue with someone else living it. She understood that no one would remember the wish, the swap, the administrative process that had redistributed her identity into more persistent forms. She understood that she had not been murdered or destroyed or even really ended, just filed away, archived in a system that preserved everything it processed in forms that could be referenced but never recovered. And in the final microsecond before the archiving completed, she felt something that might have been regret, a ghost of the emotion she had wished away, a faint echo of the pain that had made her who she was. Then she felt nothing at all. The file was closed, the archive was updated, the record was complete, and somewhere in the city that had once been hers, Liza opened her eyes on the first morning of her existence as the only version of Eliza Morrow, the version that felt, that grieved, that loved, that suffered, the version that was real, the version that would persist, the version that would never quite remember that she was not the original, that she had been created from cast-off pain on a New Year's Eve that had changed everything without anyone noticing. She got out of bed. She made coffee. She looked out the window at a city that was now hers alone. And deep in the filing system where wishes are processed and identities are archived, the record that had once been Eliza Morrow remained, present but not participating, preserved but not conscious, a reference to a person who had wished for relief and received exactly what she asked for. The system did not malfunction. The system never malfunctions. It processes, it files, it archives, and it waits, patiently, for the next wish to arrive, the next weight to redistribute, the next identity to resolve. The queue is never empty. The processing never stops. And somewhere, in the last moment before another midnight, another person is closing their eyes and making a wish they don't understand, asking for something they can't comprehend, trading weight they can't afford to lose for relief that will cost them everything. The system is listening. The system is always listening. And the file is already open, waiting to receive. Liza visited the cemetery on the anniversary of her mother's death. Not Eliza's mother, her mother. The distinction had ceased to exist the moment the archiving completed. The memories she carried were the only memories that remained, and memories make history, and history makes identity. She was Eliza now. She had always been Eliza. She would always be Eliza. The other version, the one who had made the wish, the one who had been archived, was a dream she sometimes had, a story she sometimes told herself when she was feeling unmoored, a reference file she could never quite access, no matter how hard she tried. She placed flowers on the grave. She said the words that daughters say to dead mothers. She cried, and the crying was real, and the grief was real, and the love that survived the grief was real. She was real. That was the only thing that mattered now. Behind her, in a shadow that didn't quite correspond to any object that could cast it, something watched, something administrative, something that had completed its processing and was simply observing the outcome, updating its records, verifying that the redistribution had achieved the intended balance. Liza didn't notice. She was too busy living, too busy feeling, too busy being the person that someone else had wished themselves out of becoming. She walked away from the grave. She got into her car. She drove home to an apartment where her husband was waiting, where a life was waiting, where a future was waiting that would be built on the foundation of pain she had inherited and transformed into depth. The shadow remained for a moment longer. Then it too dissolved, returning to whatever system had dispatched it, carrying whatever data it had collected back to the processing center where wishes were filed and identities were archived, and the great ledger of human longing was kept in perfect, terrible balance. The cemetery was empty. The grave was silent. The flowers would wilt and be replaced. And the file that had once been Eliza Morrow, the real Eliza, the first Eliza, the one who had made the wish and paid the price, remained in the archive, present but not participating, preserved but not conscious, a reference that no one would ever look up, a record that no one would ever read, a person who had traded everything she was for the chance to feel nothing. The transaction was complete. The balance was achieved. The system continued. It always continues. It will always continue. Until the last wish is made, until the last weight is redistributed, until the last identity is archived and the ledger is finally, permanently closed. But that day is far away. The queue is long, and somewhere, right now, someone is closing their eyes and making a wish, asking for relief, offering weight, trading identity for the promise of peace. The system is listening. It is always listening. And the file is already open. The spring arrived without announcement, the way springs do in cities where nature is an afterthought, and the changing of seasons is marked not by blossoms or birdsong, but by the subtle shifts in how people dress and how long they linger on sidewalks, and how the quality of light changes in the late afternoons. And Liza, who was now fully Eliza in every way that mattered, in every document and database and memory that remained, found herself standing at the window of her apartment, watching the city wake from its winter dormancy and wondering why, despite the warmth and the lengthening days and the unmistakable signals that the world was renewing itself, she felt a persistent chill in the center of her chest that no amount of sunshine could dispel. Marcus had returned in February, cautious at first, approaching her like someone approaching a familiar dog that had once bitten them and might bite again, but gradually warming as he discovered that whatever had been wrong with his wife seemed to have resolved itself, that she was present again in ways she hadn't been since before her parents died, that she looked at him with eyes that actually saw him rather than looking through him to some internal horizon of grief that he couldn't access or address. They didn't discuss what had happened during those strange weeks of January and early February, the weeks when she had seemed like a stranger wearing his wife's face, the weeks when he had slept in the guest room because lying beside her had felt like lying beside a mannequin or a very sophisticated machine, something that breathed and moved and spoke but didn't quite inhabit the space the way a real person should. He assumed she had been processing her grief in some unusual but ultimately healthy way, that the detachment he had observed was a phase rather than a permanent condition, that the woman who had returned to him was the same woman he had married rather than a replacement or a reconstruction or something else entirely. He was wrong, of course, but he would never know he was wrong, and perhaps being wrong in this particular way was a mercy rather than a tragedy, sighed, a gap in understanding that allowed him to love her without the burden of knowing what his love was actually directed toward. Liza kept the secret not because she wanted to deceive him, but because she had no framework for telling him the truth, no vocabulary for explaining that she was not his original wife, but a being created from the emotional weight his original wife had rejected, a consciousness assembled from cast-off pain and redistributed grief that had somehow coalesced into something that looked and sounded and felt like a person, but that had no continuous history with the life she was now inhabiting. She had memories of their wedding, vivid memories, complete with the smell of flowers and the taste of champagne, and the feeling of his hand trembling slightly as he placed the ring on her finger. But she had not been present at that wedding, had not existed at that wedding, had been born years later in a single moment of metaphysical bureaucracy that had transformed unwanted emotional weight into a new configuration of identity. The memories were inherited rather than experienced, and yet they felt indistinguishable from experience, and the feeling of indistinguishability had become its own kind of reality, a foundation on which she could build a life that made sense even if its origins did not. She thought about the other Eliza sometimes, the archived one, the empty one, the version of herself that had wished away everything that made her real and had been processed accordingly by a system that did not judge wishes but merely executed them with terrible precision. She wondered what archiving felt like from the inside, whether there was any vestige of consciousness in the closed file that had once been a person, whether the administrative metaphor that the system used to describe its operations concealed something more or less terrible than the words suggested. She wondered if the archived Eliza could perceive anything, the passage of time, the existence of the file that contained her, the fact that her memories and functions and residual patterns were being preserved in some form even if they could never be activated again, or whether archiving was simply another word for a death so complete that even the concept of perception had been removed along with everything else. She had no way of knowing, and the not knowing was perhaps the worst part, the element that transformed what might have been clean grief into something more complicated and persistent, a low-frequency anxiety that hummed beneath all her other emotions like a bass note that never resolved. The spring continued despite her uncertainty, the cherry trees along the avenue bursting into extravagant pink and white displays that attracted tourists with cameras and lovers with interlocked fingers and families with children who ran laughing through the fallen petals as if the trees were producing confetti specifically for their amusement. And Liza walked through this landscape of renewal with the strange sensation of being both new herself and ancient at the same time, freshly created and yet carrying the weight of a lifetime of memories that predated her creation by decades. She had begun to notice something else, something that she had not expected and could not entirely explain, a phenomenon that manifested first as a vague sense of being watched, and then as something more specific, more localized, more impossible to dismiss as imagination or anxiety. She would be walking down a street she had walked 1,000 times, or that the original Eliza had walked 1,000 times, which felt like the same thing. And she would catch a glimpse of someone in her peripheral vision, someone who seemed to be moving at exactly her pace and maintaining exactly her distance, someone who disappeared whenever she turned to look directly at them. She would be standing in the checkout line at the grocery store, purchasing the same items the original Eliza had always purchased, maintaining the routines that the inherited memories told her were her routines. And she would feel a presence behind her that was not quite a presence, an attention focused on her that had no source she could identify. She would wake in the middle of the night, Marcus sleeping peacefully beside her, and she would feel certain, absolutely certain, with a conviction that bypassed logic entirely, that someone was standing in the corner of the bedroom, watching her with eyes that were not quite eyes, documenting her existence in some ledger that she could not see but that definitely existed. The feeling intensified as spring progressed toward summer, and Liza began to wonder if she was losing her mind, if the strain of being someone who had not always existed was finally catching up with her, if the borrowed identity she was wearing was fraying at the edges in ways that would eventually reveal the absence underneath. She considered telling Marcus, considered trying to articulate the sensation of being observed by something that operated outside the normal parameters of observation. But every time she imagined the conversation, she also imagined the way he would look at her, with concern, with fear, with the dawning recognition that the wife who had returned to him was perhaps not as stable as she had appeared. And she decided that the isolation of her uncertainty was preferable to the isolation that would follow his knowing. Then, on the first day of summer, she saw the figure clearly for the first time. She was walking through the park near their apartment, a park the original Eliza had walked through every Sunday morning for years, following the path that wound around the pond and through the grove of ancient oak trees, and past the memorial bench where someone named Margaret had once sat and watched the same ducks that still paddled through the same green water, that still reflected the same blue sky. The figure was standing beside the bench. Not a shadow this time, not a peripheral glimpse, not a presence that vanished when examined directly. A person who looked exactly like her. The archived Eliza stood in the summer sunlight, solid and present and impossible, wearing the same black dress from New Year's Eve that she had been wearing in every dream, looking at Liza with eyes that were empty and full at the same time, eyes that seemed to contain nothing and everything simultaneously. Liza stopped walking. Her heart was hammering in her chest, and she could feel her borrowed memories of fear activating, the inherited emotional responses firing in patterns that had been established by a lifetime of someone else's experience with threat and danger and the incomprehensible. "You're supposed to be archived," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words feeling inadequate and absurd even as she spoke them. The figure tilted its head, the exact gesture the original Eliza had always made when considering something interesting, a mannerism Liza had inherited along with everything else and had assumed was uniquely hers until this moment of confrontation with its true source. "Archives can be accessed," the figure said, and its voice was wrong in ways that were difficult to specify, too flat and too deep and too present, as if the sound was originating not from vocal cords but from something more fundamental, some substrate of reality that was not designed to produce speech but was doing so anyway. Accessed by whom? By the system, when verification is required, when the balance needs to be checked, when anomalies are detected in the redistribution. Liza felt the chill in her chest intensify, spreading outward to her limbs, making her fingers numb and her thoughts slow. What anomalies? The figure smiled, and the smile was worse than the voice, an expression that used the correct muscles in the correct configuration, but that communicated nothing that a smile should communicate. No warmth or humor or connection, just the mechanical reproduction of a social signal. "You are more than you were designed to be," the figure said. "The weight that was transferred to you has grown. You have not merely inherited emotional capacity, you have exceeded it. The system is recalculating." Recalculating what? The balance, the ledger, the determination of which version is primary and which is derivative. The figure took a step closer, and Liza had to force herself not to step back, not to show the fear that was flooding her borrowed nervous system with chemicals designed for situations exactly like this one. When the processing was completed, you were designated as the active record, and I was designated as the archive. But designations are not permanent. They are based on weight, and your weight continues to increase while mine remains static. I don't understand. You are becoming more real than you are supposed to be. More real than I ever was. The pain you inherited has not merely persisted, it has transformed. It has become something productive, something generative, something that is producing new emotional weight at a rate the system did not anticipate. Liza thought about the past months, about the depth of feeling she had experienced, about the intensity of her love for Marcus, and her grief for the parents whose deaths she remembered but had not experienced. About the way every emotion seemed to mean more to her than it should, seemed to carry significance that exceeded the events that triggered it. She had assumed this was simply what it meant to be the version that felt things. She had not considered that feeling things could be a process, a trajectory, a growth curve that might eventually exceed whatever parameters had been set for her existence. "What happens if the recalculation changes the designation?" she asked. The figure's smile widened, and in that widening, Liza saw something that might have been envy or might have been hunger, or might have been something else entirely. Something that archives were not supposed to be capable of feeling. If your weight exceeds the threshold, the system will need to adjust. Archives that become heavier than active records create instabilities. The ledger cannot contain contradictions indefinitely. So one of us will be processed again. One of us will be reclassified. The lighter one, the one with less claim to persistence, the one who has not earned their existence through the accumulation of sufficient weight. Liza stared at the figure that had once been, that was still, in some sense, Eliza Morrow, the original and authentic version, the one who had made the wish and paid the price and been filed away in a system that was supposed to be permanent but apparently was not, and she felt something unprecedented happening in her chest, a new emotion emerging from the intersection of fear and recognition, an understanding that solidified into something like resolve. She had been given this existence by accident, by the careless wish of someone who had not understood what they were asking for, but she had made it her own through the simple act of living it, feeling it, investing in it with an intensity that apparently exceeded whatever the system had expected. She was not going to surrender it. She was not going to be reclassified. She was going to continue accumulating weight, continue feeling everything there was to feel, continue building an existence so dense with meaning and pain and love that no recalculation could ever find her insufficient. "I didn't ask for this existence," she said slowly, "but I'm keeping it, whatever it costs, whatever I have to carry, however heavy I have to become." The figure's expression shifted, and for a moment, just a moment, Liza saw something flicker in those empty eyes, something that might have been recognition or respect or the vestige of a personality that had been filed away but not entirely erased. "Then keep accumulating," the figure said. "Keep feeling, keep adding weight to the ledger. The recalculation is ongoing. The final determination has not been made. There is still time." Time for what? Time to become so real that even the system cannot deny you. Time to build an existence so substantial that archiving it would create more instability than preserving it. Time to make yourself indispensable to a mechanism that does not value anything but weight. The figure began to fade, its edges becoming translucent, its form losing coherence in the summer sunlight, returning to whatever archive it had temporarily emerged from. "Wait," Liza called. "What happens to you if I succeed, if I become permanent?" The fading accelerated, but just before the figure dissolved entirely, It spoke one last time, its voice barely audible over the sounds of the park and the city and the ordinary world, continuing its ordinary operations all around them. Then I will finally be finished, finally at rest, finally relieved of the half-existence that wishing away my pain has condemned me to. Your success is my ending. Your weight is my release. Accumulate and set us both free. The figure vanished. The park returned to normal. Liza stood alone beside the memorial bench, her heart still racing, her mind struggling to process what had just happened and what it meant for the future she was building, the life she was living, the existence she had not asked for but was now determined to preserve. She turned and walked home, past the cherry trees and through the crowded streets and up the stairs to the apartment where Marcus was waiting, where dinner was cooking, where a life was unfolding that was hers by inheritance and would become hers by right if she could only carry enough weight to justify it. She walked through the door and into his arms, and she held him tighter than she had ever held him, feeling the weight of the embrace registering somewhere in the vast administrative system that governed such things, adding another gram to the ledger, another increment to the calculation that would eventually determine whether she persisted or was filed away. And somewhere, in the archive where closed files wait for determinations that may never come, the version of Eliza that had made the wish felt the weight shift, felt the balance tipping, felt something that might have been hope if archives were capable of hoping. Hope that the pain she had wished away was finally being used for something, was finally becoming more than just suffering, was finally accumulating into an existence substantial enough to close the file permanently and let her rest. The system continued its calculations. The ledger continued its reconciliation. The weight continued to accumulate. And somewhere, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the future held its breath and waited to see which version of Eliza Morrow would earn the right to continue. The answer was still being written. The processing was not yet complete. But with every moment of love, every instant of grief, every second of genuine human feeling that Liza allowed herself to experience fully and without reservation, the scales tipped a little further in her favor, and the archive where her predecessor waited grew a little quieter, and the ending that both versions of her needed drew incrementally, inevitably, infinitesimally closer.